Yep, okay, that looks good. All right, we are all set.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our second EER seminar for the winter 2026 semester. Thank you for joining us this Friday morning. I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Professor Mark Huerta from Virginia Tech, Department of Engineering Education. I believe he's going to tell you a little bit about his background, but I want to highlight Mark is a fantastic scholar and collaborator of mine, and I'm so thrilled to have him here. He's also very recognized in his teaching, has won many teaching awards throughout his work teaching both Virginia Tech as well as Arizona State University, where he was a faculty prior to joining Virginia Tech. Also the co-founder and now on the board of 33 Buckets, which is a nonprofit organization that serves underserved communities with clean water. So lots of different interesting aspects of all of his work. He's going to be sharing some of his research with us today. And please join me in a warm welcome for Professor Huerta. Thank you for being here.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jensen, for the warm introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. I've had such an amazing visit in Ann Arbor. I had visited once many years ago when I was younger for a wedding, but didn't quite get to tour the city and see as much of the college or the university as last time. So it's been wonderful connecting with a lot of the students and the faculty here. And so I'm going to share a little bit more about some of my research today. And the title of my talk is Beyond Technical Competence, Designing Engineering Education for Psychological Safety and Professional Flourishing. So this is a major thread in some of the research, and so I'm going to highlight one or two kind of main projects that I've been working on related to that. And so I broke down my talk into kind of two main areas, and then I'll leave time for Q&A at the end here. So I'm going to share a little bit more about my background. I think this is particularly helpful for grad students to kind of see one pathway into engineering education, and maybe you'll see yourself in some aspects of that. And then I'm going to highlight some of my research. I'm going to focus on the teamwork development project today, but I'll also make some connections to some of the other things I'm working on towards the end. And then, yeah, we'll save some time for Q&A. And so, as Dr. Jensen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech. Before then, I taught 2 years at Arizona State, and I actually did my undergrad and grad doctoral program there as well. So my PhD is in engineering education. I studied biomedical engineering for my undergrad, bachelor's, and master's degree as well. And when I graduated, I worked as a project engineer for a consulting company where I helped entrepreneurs design and develop their various entrepreneurial ideas. I worked for a biomedical diagnostics company as well. And during those 2 years, I enjoyed the engineering work, but I had some cool opportunities to teach a couple programs at a community college. So one of them was called the Poder program, Empowering Latino Students. And I taught social entrepreneurship, leadership, and I just felt like my place was in the classroom, connecting with students and helping them reach their potential. And so during a random hot yoga session, one of my mentors, Scott Shrake, mentioned, hey, ASU is starting this engineering education PhD program. This might be something that you're really interested in. And so I jumped at that opportunity. And so one of the kind of transformative experiences I had as an undergrad and graduate students, as a grad student, was this 33 Buckets that Dr. Jensen mentioned. And so I was a student in this program called Engineering Projects and Community Service. Perhaps you've heard of it. Started out at Purdue, but a bunch of universities have adopted it within their own context. And so I had these awesome experiences working with different teams and traveling to Bangladesh, Peru, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and working with different communities and setting up these clean water systems in these various contexts. And I was very fortunate to have a bunch of entrepreneurship competitions, opportunities to fundraise, and we were able to kind of get some traction within the university where they started kind of sharing it out there. and we were able to co-found a nonprofit organization called 33 Buckets. And so these are some of the communities that we've worked in. But really this experience instilled in me this value of experiential learning and putting students into these authentic sort of learning environments, and where they were very responsible and had the opportunity to serve their communities in a positive way. And also through this experience, it profoundly helped me develop my teamwork and leadership skills, but just developing an appreciation for human-centered design work in engineering education. And so these type of experiences really instilled a lot of the values I hold today as an educator. And so when I was doing my PhD, I was concurrently developing 33 Buckets. And so one of the things I was very interested in at that time, and still today, is this mental health and well-being, and just observing, as Dr. Jensen describes, the stress culture in engineering education. And so my PhD actually research looked at mindfulness education and how to bring that into practical ways and adopt it to the context, or tailor it to the engineering education context. And so I started to investigate those things, and I got a lot of very positive feedback from a lot of the students that participated in this intervention. And there was a lot of connections to how mindfulness and really looking at your habits of mind connected to professional skills that are so important in engineering education, like teamwork, leadership, communication, etc. And so a lot of students were able to make connections and actually see that transfer into these sort of contexts. And so when I graduated, I had the opportunity to transition right into an teaching assistant professor. So this is very much teaching focused role. So it's this very much full circle experience where I was a student in EPICS and now I was co-directing it. And so I was teaching that, Global Resolve, and within the first year project-based learning context, I was also teaching in there. And so I noticed that when in this kind of professor position, I expected it to be a lot more sort of lecturing, introducing students to content, things like that. But in these contexts, really the professor faculty role is coaching, managing students in these interdisciplinary teams and giving good feedback, scaffolding the project. And so it really, I guess, instilled in me sort of this, like, the importance of the faculty being a good leader and supporting those teamwork processes. And so then I eventually transitioned into an assistant professor role at Virginia Tech. And so at first I was a visiting professor, and then I eventually transitioned into the more research track. And so I've met with a lot of the students here one-on-one. And so I think it's sometimes surprising that, you know, somebody could go the teaching track and kind of make their way back into the research track. But there are many different pathways into going this. And a lot of the research ideas I have, I think were very much, I guess, cultivated from my experience teaching a lot of courses. So I joke around my colleagues, but in these 2 years of teaching, I often taught extra courses during this time for the Honors College. So oftentimes I was teaching 5, 6 courses a semester. So in those 2 years of teaching, I have taught easily double to triple the amount of courses I've taught in 5 years at Virginia Tech. And so it was very much this immersive kind of experience in the classroom. And so when I came to Virginia Tech, I was very excited to teach in their first year design program and see some of the differences and being able to bring some of the things that I've learned at ASU. But one of the things I was really excited to was to bring something like EPICS to Virginia Tech. And so I was able to co-construct the interdisciplinary projects program with colleagues at Virginia Tech. And so this is sort of similar in the mold, where we basically partner with different community partners, researchers, industry, and scope real-world engineering projects for students. And so we've been able to grow it. We're 238 plus students have now gone through this over the last couple of years. And it's gotten to the point where last semester, we actually grew it to the point where we had to reject 100 student applicants because we didn't have enough capacity and room to be able to bring all these students into the class. And so it just goes to show when you build these sort of types of opportunities where students can can really get involved in experiential learning, these real world projects, students really gravitate and find these experiences to be very valuable. And so also my role, I'm the Bridge Experience Coordinator, which is a newer initiative at Virginia Tech that basically makes experiential learning a requirement for graduates or for all students, and it's a graduation requirement. And so when I think about kind of my previous experiences and how it's really shaped my research interests, and once you start getting far along in the tenure track, you kind of start to think about like, what is the thread that's kind of like tying all my research together? What's kind of the story here? And so there's really kind of two areas of focus of my research. And one is examining and improving well-being across the academic lifestyle, and the other is designing interdisciplinary and experiential learning environments for professional formation. So today, I'm going to highlight the teamwork project. It was sort of this decision, do I highlight all of the work and not get into much depth into any of it, or do I kind of highlight one main project and go into a little bit more depth? So I'm going to opt for that route today. And so I'm curious kind of how that goes. And so my research very much is like research to practice and vice versa. So a lot of the research explores kind of different stakeholder perceptions of various phenomena. And then I try to implement things in the classroom or different contexts like policy, and then try to evaluate the changes there. And so this project I'm going to highlight on teamwork, very much you'll see the research to practice connection there. All right. So I have a quick sort of discussion prompt here, but on a scale from 1 to 5, how safe do you typically feel speaking up in teams? And so this can be any context that comes to mind. It could be your research group, it could be a team project, it could be a sport, or maybe another committee you're on, or whatever sort of comes to mind when you think about that. And so I want you to kind of think of that number in your head. You don't have to say it out loud. And then what's one thing that would move you up by 1 point? So does anybody have any thoughts on what might improve their ability to speak up in a various context? Yeah.
On the team that I feel
I think spending time on the team, so I feel some kind of ownership or sense of belonging there. So if I'm on a committee that's largely people outside of my unit whom I don't know and have a prior relationship, I tend to be more reticent as opposed to the people I have a prior relationship with.
Yeah, so it takes time to build, get to know the people that you're, I guess, interacting with, working with on something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To make you get your exercise. I would say team leadership that facilitates better and sort of encourages voices from newer or more junior members, and maybe also quiets voices from older, more aggressive members.
Absolutely. So very intentional leadership, encouraging certain folks to speak up that maybe won't do it on their own accord initially. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else come to mind? Yeah.
Typically feel until I know that that group is one that actually values my opinion and is going to listen to me, because there's no point speaking up if nothing's going to be taken into account.
Awesome. So feeling like your opinion's going to be valued, maybe getting some affirmations from sharing your opinion and having that be recognized in a good way will sort of encourage you to potentially speak up more in future interactions. Yeah, that is fantastic. Okay, so you all kind of hit all the main things, I think. So this is kind of the idea around psychological safety. And so just so we all have a shared sort of definition here, psychological safety has been defined as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. In psychologically safe teams, team members feel accepted and respected. So you feel like you can bring your whole self to the interactions and can speak up, share your perspective, things along those lines. And as Aaron kind of mentioned here, leadership is very critical to establishing psychological safety in groups. And so there's a whole body of literature in industrial and organizational psychology that looks and investigates psychology, mainly in an industry context, and has found leadership can either promote it or very much diminish psychological safety. And so the impacts are actually quite profound in terms of how psychological safety impacts performance, learning, innovation within various contexts. And so this is a very critical sort of idea in terms of how we can optimize team performance. And so within more of a kind of traditional engineering context, so Google, their people analytics unit did this big internal study, and they found psychological safety was the top trait of successful teams that performed very well. And sort of in their explanations, they said that teams that work well are comfortable being wrong around each other. So they're gonna put their ideas out there. And in the best team, each team member spends about the same amount of time talking. So there's very much observable things you can kind of look at to see if psychological safety is there. Is everybody actually involved in the conversation, sharing their ideas, listening to one another? And so these are things that you can look at within your own research groups or different committees or things you're involved in, student organizations, and be a leader in those teams and promoting sort of others to share their perspectives that are maybe a little bit more quiet. And so in the student sort of context, in these project-based learning classes, what are some of the problems that you all have kind of observed, maybe through personal experience or maybe as an instructor for some of these types of courses?
I think a classic one is that some students feeling that at least one other student is not playing their role, doing their work. And so the burden falls on certain students. That can create a lot of conflict within the team.
Absolutely. So certain students not pulling their weight, maybe contributing or engaging.
Students divide and conquer the work rather than everybody learning all the different pieces.
Absolutely. So this lack of interdependence, it's not really teamwork. They're just kind of dividing and doing things on their own.
I think one student asserting that they are the expert more so than other students, and then not accepting other students' suggestions.
Absolutely. I think this can be somewhat common in the first year context where students are coming in with very much different levels of prior experience in engineering. Maybe some students have already done a robotics course and come in with a lot versus others. This might be their very first engineering experience. So yeah, absolutely. So sort of this dominance of one potential member, a couple members.
A mismatch of expectations for how much work they're going to put in or how good the final product has to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So expecting sort of different quality difference in terms of what that final product should look like, and perhaps getting frustrated that others don't share that sort of same perception. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, these are a lot of the common problems that we observe in teams. And so a lot of these problems will lead to conflicts within the team, whether the students recognize them, choose to recognize them or not. And so Jen's typology highlights 3 different types of conflicts. So there's relationship conflict, process conflict, and task conflict. So relationship conflict, as you might guess, has to do more with interpersonal sort of tensions, annoyances, can even evolve to animosity among group members. Process conflicts has to do more with disagreements about how the work should be delegated, who is responsible for what, and how tasks should be accomplished. So just as the name says the process of how we actually achieve our work outcomes. Task conflict has to do with disagreements about the work content being performed, including differences in viewpoints, ideas, and opinions. And so with that in mind, are all of these types of conflicts inherently bad for teams? So is one of these conflicts potentially useful in some way? Yeah. Task conflict. Does everybody agree? Does anybody want to advocate for one of the other ones? Okay, yeah, you're right. It is task conflict, can be very helpful. And why do you think that is?
Friendly professional debate about what you should be doing.
Yeah.
To find the best solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Task conflict, if handled, with respect, can actually be very productive to teams. And so too often in especially engineering teams, somebody says an idea and everybody's just like, oh yeah, let's just go along with that. And there isn't really this productive sort of ideation, disagreement, and really thinking through, is this the right thing to do? And especially early on in teams where psychological safety isn't fully kind of developed, task conflict is very, very difficult to do because you don't quite maybe feel safe to disagree in those early interactions. And so O'Neill and colleagues basically created these sort of conflict typologies, I guess you could say, of what healthy conflict versus unhealthy conflict looks like. And as you mentioned, the healthy conflict profiles tend to have higher task conflict and minimize relationship and process conflicts, versus the unhealthy sort of conflict profiles, you tend to see a lot more of these process and relationship conflicts. And so this is sort of like a conceptual framework I applied to one of the research projects is, okay, we have these sort of profiles of conflict and how students might handle conflict. How might we be able to look at psychological safety and support that process so students can actually adopt more of these healthy conflict profiles? And so initially, we just kind of wanted to understand how does psychological safety and conflict evolve in these teams. So you can see the research question there. What are students' experiences with psychological safety and conflict? And so we collected data from 82 students. We looked at written reflections throughout the semester, and then we did focus groups at the end of the semester. And so I built these focus groups within the class as this sort of debrief activity, which ended up actually working really well. And so we brought student researchers to support that data collection. And then we thematically analyzed this using the framework. And so just so you have an idea of what one of the reflections looks like, we never directly asked them about conflict or psychological safety, but we'd find different ways to describe it. So this one really gets at task conflict. So for example, think of an important group decision that you had to make where all the perspectives of the group members considered. Were there any disagreements or conflicting opinions? So I guess in this one, we did ask about conflicting opinions and then disagreements, how was it handled, et cetera. And so students would respond to a series of prompts like this, and they were just graded on completion. So we weren't necessarily grading them based on, we wanted them to be as honest and transparent as possible. And so we analyzed this data deductively using this framework. And this is the one I kind of want to focus a little bit on. But as you kind of mentioned, it takes time to cultivate psychological safety was one of our key findings. And so these initial interactions students have, which might be unsurprising, is a little awkward. They're kind of feeling each other out early in the semester. And so there isn't a lot of like open communication. Some students might be a little bit more comfortable and open up quickly, but the overall collective sentiment is like we're kind of feeling each other out. So psychological safety tends to start low, but it starts to improve over the course of semester. So it's really just the culmination of a lot of small positive interactions that steadily support psychological safety improving. But then once you start getting into the teamwork, group decision-making, submitting reports, presentations, conflicts tend to start happening there, whether students acknowledge them or not. And so most of these conflicts are process-related conflicts. So-and-so, procrastinated on their part of the assignment, and it created a lot of stress for me and the rest of my team. I tried to send a text message to so-and-so, they ghosted me. So it could be student absences. So a lot of these classes, these project-based learning classes, you only meet twice a week. So if somebody is sick that week, the team has to kind of scramble and communicate and organize themselves on the fly without being able to meet each other. And so those types of things start to become pretty common. And so we sort of see this then kind of break up into whether a team handles these conflicts well or doesn't handle. And obviously there's like a full kind of spectrum there. But the teams that handle this well tend to have built psychological safety to a point where then they can kind of be more, I guess, proactive in addressing these conflicts and actually address them instead of just avoiding them and sweeping them under the rug, right? So they have enough psychological safety where they can sort of have this task conflict, bring things up, and those process conflicts tend to get resolved where they're not, impacting the team throughout the semester. And so those teams develop healthy team dynamics. And because of that process and feedback, the psychological safety is actually enhanced. Versus the teams, a lot of students will kind of just like, they maybe try to bring it up in small ways, kind of indirectly. But as soon as those things like aren't addressed and removed, and a lot of these students are kind of conflict avoidant, these process conflicts tend to just snowball and get worse and worse. And so a lot of the times it'll evolve into relationship type conflicts where students are annoyed at each other, frustrated, but the other student, the students that are maybe the source of the conflict or not engaged or whatever, don't tend to necessarily know there's a problem. So it's sort of this like avoidance that happens. And then because it hasn't been brought up right away and the thing just continues to happen, psychological safety actually decreases, where the longer it kind of goes on, the more they're more likely to just kind of like, I just need to get through the semester or whatever. I'm not going to bring it up. It's not worth it sort of deal. And so once we kind of like started like understanding how psychological safety and these conflict processes evolve in teams, we really started to get to what can we actually do from an instructional perspective to address these things. So I'm curious, in your experiences, either as a student or an instructor, what do you typically do to teach or facilitate teamwork?
I guess it's kind of a classic, but once they get to know each other a little bit, I encourage them to come up with some kind of a team contract, not necessarily very formal, but making some agreements and then coming back to that and making adjustments, talking about how things are going at least several more times, some check-ins.
Yeah, absolutely. So team contracts, check-ins.
I've done project health checkpoints. So throughout the class, they will check in on how the project is going. And then within their team, usually that has like a CAPME or some sort of review along with that. But they're comparing not just their teamwork dynamics, but also how the project is progressing and kind of who's contributing and how.
Excellent. So like peer evaluations, debriefs on that sort of information. Awesome.
I had the Office of Student Conflict Resolution come in and give like a 1-hour workshop on conflict resolution.
Excellent. That's fantastic. So I'm not going to touch on it today, but one of the things we did was design a conflict management workshop, which sounds pretty similar to what you guys did.
All right, this is not to call out Virginia Tech. This is not an observation of Virginia Tech, but in research on other faculty, I have seen that a lot of faculty think, or technical engineering faculty think that putting students in teams just assumes that they will learn teamwork skills on their own, and they don't need to do anything to facilitate that. And so in learning about how are professional skills taught, I often find that they are not taught.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Along those lines too, thinking about going through some kind of formal ideation process. So they're all bringing ideas to the table and giving them tools to decide among ideas so that they don't just kind of take that path of least resistance and go with the first idea they come to.
Absolutely. So really scaffolding, supporting that ideation process. Awesome. So Gabriella stole my thunder. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's perfect. It's a great segue here. So Goldsmith and colleagues sort of characterize the different teamwork instructional, approaches here. And so you can see there's a spectrum between passive and active on the x-axis and administrative versus pedagogical on the y-axis. And you can see different sort of approaches, mapped into this quad chart. And so basically in reviewing the literature, they found that teamwork approaches tend to be more administrative focused, and there's less well-developed active pedagogical sort of strategies here. So really even though there's things identified here, we tend not to do a lot of this. So you mentioned team charters, so it starts to get a little bit more into sort of this active side because they're establishing norms early on this semester. Peer evaluations tend to be more of this administrative thing, but they are active. They get students to sort of, assess each other there. So yeah, as Gabriella mentioned, there's been some research on sort of faculty perceptions of, how teamwork should be taught and facilitated. And so there's this overwhelming consensus that, let's just put students on teams and through experience, they'll figure it out, they'll learn. And I think to some extent, there's probably some truth in that, but without scaffolding, support, more intentional sort of design, I think we're really missing out on an opportunity to more intentionally support teamwork. And the other sort of thing that tends to happen in these classes is instructors tend to focus on assessing the outcomes of team projects, so presentations, reports, things like that, so the final product, rather than evaluating the process of teamwork. So unintentionally, we might be sort of reinforcing some of these things because students, their process might be terrible, right? They might be having all kinds of process conflicts, being frustrated, but then they get that mid-semester report and they get an A and they're like, whatever, like the performance is good, I'll just deal with it for another 8 weeks. And so you sort of might be reinforcing sort of these not ideal team dynamics, I guess you could say, because there is this feedback loop that happens, right? So if they're getting good grades despite having a terrible process, what's the incentive for students to really change and address these things and improve? And so one of the things that my colleagues and I were really interested in is, so how can we sort of reinforce a more positive feedback loop and give students actually real-time sort of feedback on their process of teamwork and more sort of assess this process of teamwork. And so there's a few different things we did, but the thing I'll highlight today is sort of how we've reimagined the peer evaluation process and took it from this more administrative thing to more of a pedagogical sort of active thing. And so we designed this intervention that has 3 components. So there's a feedback training, there's the self and peer evaluation, which is a common thing that happens in these project-based learning classes. And then we had these reflections, debriefs. And so in step 1, the feedback literacy training, we clarified the expectations and the goals of the self and peer evaluation process. And so it's a very active sort of session where we get students to kind of highlight, why do you think we do this? Like, what's the purpose of this? Do you think we're trying to like discover who's not doing what and punish them with the grades and things like that? And so we try to bring that out and then kind of say, hey, that's not what we're trying to do here. And so really the goal of this is to provide formative feedback. And so if you're not being transparent and honest in how you rate your teammates and how you describe them, you're very much missing out on an opportunity to support their professional development. And you're actually doing them a disservice by not giving them sort of honest, critical, constructive feedback, and even highlighting specifically the positive things they're doing too, because you're not going to necessarily reinforce those things. And so we do highlight, like, this is a tool for us to monitor and support teams, but especially early on in the semester when we're doing this, we're not doing this to try to negatively impact anybody's grades. And so we clarify expectations and try to remove all the sort of negative sort of perception students might have about this process. And then we actually provide guidance and clear expectations on how to actually write feedback and to approach sort of those rating systems. So for example, some of you might be familiar with CAPME. I know Robin's pioneered Teammates as well. And so a lot of these peer evaluation systems, students rate each other on a 1 to 5 scale across different teamwork dimensions, right? And so without any instruction, a very common thing that happens is students are like, I'm just gonna rate everybody a 5, right? Because I don't wanna deal with like people not feeling like they're doing well and you know, I don't wanna impact anybody's grade negatively. So there's sort of this discomfort involved in the peer evaluation process that very much influences how they actually rate each other. And so if you actually look at the scales, a 5 is in CAPME is exceeding expectations across the teamwork dimensions, right? A 3 is actually like a solid rating. A teammate is doing what they're supposed to do. So we actually encourage them to use the full spectrum there and say, if you're rating your teammate a 3, that means they're doing their job. Reserve 4s and 5s for teammates that are actually going above and beyond on that specific dimension. So kind of breaking that down for them. And then we actually encourage them and give them specific training on how to actually write good feedback. So specific on observable teamwork behaviors. And we give them a bunch of examples on what this looks like and what this does not look like. And so without doing this, the common thing I'd see is like, great teammate, good job, like very generic, kind of like low effort, sort of qualitative comments that doesn't give me any information. If I release that feedback, it's not gonna help them. It doesn't actually give them any specific feedback. And so in these comment boxes, students have the opportunity to sort of write feedback. And so we created a rubric that actually assesses the quality of feedback they're writing to their peers. We encourage them to write positive feedback as well. And if there's critical, constructive feedback, we strongly encourage that as well. So we have these clear instructions and rubrics, and we actually just like did a comparison of the pre-post, and the comments were substantially longer, much better quality. And so there was a very noticeable impact in terms of the feedback that was provided. And we saw way less sort of all 4s and 5s sort of deal, like students actually use the full spectrum of the quantitative sort of metrics, their feedback. And so part 2 here is then we created feedback reports using generative AI. And so this is, I think, a good use case of AI because AI is very useful in being able to summarize, synthesize content in a way that's easy to sort of digest, right? And so there was a couple benefits we were thinking here, making a safer process. So a lot of the times instructors opt not to release the comments to their peers because there's this sort of concern, well, students might not be honest if they know that their comment is going to be released to their peers. Even if it's anonymized, if you have a team of 5, you can probably guess who the comment's coming from, right, to some extent. So by integrating everybody's comments in a feedback report, it adds another layer of confidentiality. And we also found AI enhances the feedback quality. And so this is just like a very high level sort of diagram to show that you might have 4 peer comments and your self comment and how they sort of get integrated into a feedback report that highlights strengths and areas of growth and then compares your self sort of reflection comment with what other people are saying to potentially highlight similarities or disparities. And so every student would receive a feedback report like this. And so we did a couple different things. One, we assessed the reports, and like I mentioned, we found that AI improved the quality of the feedback. So sometimes students were really good at highlighting critical feedback, but they wouldn't add that extra step of actionable feedback, even though we coached us on it. And so a lot of the times AI was able to take that feedback and provide an actionable step for the student to be able to do. The other thing that was really helpful is addressing sort of these inappropriate or irrelevant comments. And so sometimes students can be a little crass in terms of how they write things. And so that's another fear instructors have in terms of releasing direct comments, is that an inappropriate comment will be released to a teammate and that could cause some negative consequences. So AI was able to kind of smooth those types of comments over, and then highlighting alignments, misalignment with the self and peer feedback. And so a couple examples here. So in this case, this is kind of, I would say, a more crass comment. So this student wrote, sometimes this student overpowers our opinions. Voicing his opinions over ours has been common and it gives off a dictator vibe. So this is kind of what Gabriella was saying, like perhaps an overly dominant student that's given off a dictator vibe. So obviously we don't want to release this comment to the student, but AI was able to kind of smooth it over and said, while your leadership and passion and diligence are admirable, you need to really think about balancing your leadership with collaborative listening, right? So taking a step back. And so still communicating what they need to hear, but in a way that's a little bit easier probably for that student to digest and not kind of like push away that feedback. Here's another example. So the self-comment, the student wrote, I have made sure to speak up about any ideas or disagreements I have. But then you look at the peer comments and the students are writing, the student could be a little bit more open, as when he does speak, it's worth listening to. And then Finn, this is a pseudonym, could do more to speak up and communicate his ideas. So here there's an obvious sort of misalignment in the student's self-perception and how their peers are kind of viewing their communication. And so the AI report said, there's a shared feeling among your teammates that they would benefit from hearing more from you. And in comparing their self-assessment, there's an invitation from your team to be more for more vocal participation in group discussions. So conveying that feedback to the student is like, hey, I know you were thinking this, but actually you could sort of be a little bit more engaged in the communication. And so students would receive this report and then complete a reflection, debrief in class using structured prompts. And so we did one immediately after, and then there was a second debrief about 5-6 weeks later in the semester that was retrospective in nature. And so this is like an example prompt of the first feedback. So based on the first reflection. So what specific actions might you take to improve your teamwork skills? How do you plan to address any constructive feedback? How do you anticipate these changes will impact the team? And so we thematically analyzed this data, and I'm going to highlight 3 main themes here. So one is appreciation for feedback. And so we weren't sure how students would handle the constructive feedback, but what was, I think, maybe a little surprising is how valuable the positive feedback actually was in sort of reinforcing teamwork behaviors they're already doing it and building confidence. So a lot of the times where students would say, I've been doing X, Y, Z, but I had no idea how it was being perceived by my teammates. And then when they hear that positive feedback, they're like, oh, wow, that's like great. So then it sort of builds this sort of psychological safety in the team to keep doing those behaviors. And in the constructive feedback, sometimes students were kind of aware of it, but other times they were not aware of it. So having that feedback can identify an area of improvement for those students. And we weren't sure how students would perceive like the AI component of the feedback, but a lot of students really found it to be valuable. And they kind of viewed the AI as sort of this objective, like sort of third party in a way that could relay the feedback in a way that was easy to digest and easy to understand. And so this quote kind of highlights that. So the feedback I received was honest and to the point without feeling rude. And then they go on to say, it is essential that these shortcomings are recognized and addressed in a clear and concise manner so that a team can function more efficiently. And it's important to keep in mind that the feedback should not be insulting or demeaning, but instead constructive. And so kind of recognizing the importance of how the feedback is conveyed was a very common sentiment here. And then through the retrospective reflections, we got to see, did students actually make changes to their teamwork or not? And the questions were very much phrased of, did you make changes to your teamwork? So students could easily just say no to those things. But a vast majority of students highlighted specific changes to their teamwork behaviors or changes they observed in other teammates. So kind of getting that triangulation sort of piece as well. So this student highlights, I've been more expressive in my ideas, more likely to contribute my ideas to group discussion. This student started brainstorming before meetings, so they were more prepared to engage in those discussions, which was a specific suggestion from their feedback report. And then perhaps the most profound change was this sort of change to the psychological safety to the team and the feedback behaviors that students started to engage in with the team. So students know where they stood. There's sort of this transparency of like, this is how I'm being perceived. And so from then on, students, by sort of setting this sort of culture expectation in the class that we're gonna support each other's growth, we're gonna be transparent in feedback, students started to do this on their own without this. So we only did this once, and then from there, we would do the self and peer evaluation, but not the AI reports. We would just directly release the reports. So this was kind of a way to scaffold the process, set expectations, and then by the end of the semester, you hope that they're being transparent and engaging in these feedback processes. So this student wrote, after getting feedback, I'm more comfortable providing others with critical feedback. Before, I was afraid to be too direct with others in case they take the feedback the wrong way or it'll strain our work relationship, which I know is a common sentiment. I believe that receiving the feedback gave me a better gauge of the level of feedback that I should provide my peers. So the AI kind of modeling this feedback process as well. In the future, my feedback will be more detailed in order to help my teams improve and give them recognition for their hard work. And so this is a really good example of reinforcing this feedback loop at an individual, personalized level to support psychological safety. And hopefully like a good illustration of kind of how the research can really inform sort of the practice side as well. And so extending to other contexts, so you can probably think of a lot of dynamic engineering environments where kind of these ideas would transfer to the idea of psychological safety, feedback processes. And so one of the collaborative projects I have with Dr. Karen Jensen is how we look at psychological safety and doctoral student advising relationships. So this is a context where there's a very clear power dynamic between faculty and students, where faculty have a major role in influencing the psychological safety of those doctoral students. And so we ask these questions of how do specific advising behaviors influence psychological safety, and how does that impact certain work-related outcomes, including the mental health and well-being of students, how they perform, how they learn, et cetera. And so I'm not gonna go as into depth as in this study, but I did wanna kind of quickly highlight some of the methods we're using and some of the similarities we're seeing between this study and the other one. And so we did a quant-to-qual explanatory mixed method study here. And as part of the follow-up interviews, we use this episodic narrative methodology. And so we are really interested in identifying these specific episodes or critical incidences where the student felt a substantial change in psychological safety, either positive or negative, and how that sort of then impacted the student moving forward. And so we did this chronologically with a number of students, where then we could kind of put together these different episodes where psychological safety was impacted. And so for our data analysis, we used what's called a composite narrative approach, where we could sort of identify trends, themes across these different narratives, and then sort of mix and match different episodes to create these narratives. That helps sort of protect the anonymity of our participants, since this can be very sensitive data and we don't want to report a full narrative on one student's experience, because that could be a little bit more identifiable. And so as part of our dissemination, we hired student actors to basically voice record and speak to some of these narratives. And so we have a number of different examples that we've been doing workshops on and getting faculty and students to kind of discuss the role of psychological safety in these incidences and what they might be able to, how they might be able to learn from these experiences that students have. So we don't necessarily unintentionally derail psychological safety and then negatively impact some of the outcomes. And so milestones, for example, was sort of one key finding, how an advisor coaches a student through a milestone, especially if they don't pass it the first time, right? It can be viewed as a learning opportunity, a growth opportunity, or in this case, the feedback might not be very helpful or actually can harm the student moving forward. And so when I kind of look at kind of the implications of both of these studies and some of the similarities, we are finding psychological safety has a profound impact on the students' mental health and well-being, particularly in the grad context. But there are these sort of shared similarities on how students learn, engage, share ideas, manage conflicts, and how they engage in feedback processes. And especially in the faculty, student, in the graduate education space, it's very hard for students to feel comfortable providing feedback to faculty. So how can you sort of get students to open up and feel safe to learn and ask questions, contribute, share ideas, challenge the status quo? And hopefully by the end of graduate school, you have a student that feels like they've learned, they're competent, and they can challenge the ideas of the advisor. And hopefully through that, you have more creativity, innovation in your research. And so how do you get your students to challenge the status quo and feel comfortable and get to that point? And another key sort of theme that we saw across both studies, psychological safety, similar to trust. It takes time to develop, to cultivate it, and leaders have an instrumental role in doing that. And just one negative action can derail it, and then it's very hard to build up from there. So really critically thinking about some of the actions you take and how you respond to things, especially when things aren't going well or a student underperforms or whatever, how you handle that can go a long way in impacting psychological safety long-term. And sort of the key kind of takeaway here is we can design engineering learning environments to promote psychological safety. And it's through culture, shared expectations, creating these intentional feedback structures, whether it's advising relationships in the classroom, et cetera. So that's all the content I have. I would like to acknowledge the different collaborators I've had, Dr. Susan Sajati, Olivia Ryan, Katie Drinkwater, Maren Fisher, who supported the teamwork project. And I'd like to highlight Dr. Jensen, Dorian, Bobbitt, Larkin Martini, and Jeannie Sanders, who've supported the grad psych safety project. And just like a little disclosure there, I do not represent the views of the NSF. So there you go. And so here's some of the papers, resources, if you're interested in kind of looking at some of the things we've done. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint after with Karen also, and then references. And yeah, I'm open for questions.
For the graduate student advisors.
We're still working on those manuscripts. There are some conference papers through the ASEE that kind of highlight the overall project. But in terms of our findings and data there, we hope to have a couple manuscripts come out in the next year or two. So, yeah.
Keep an eye out.
Yeah.
On that topic, do you have opinions on how you think students can try improving psychological safety in those relationships from their end?
Yeah, on the grad advising relationship. Yeah, I mean, in this case, it always takes two, right, to support psychological safety, and advisors might be able to do everything in their power to kind of get a student to open up, and then they might not want to be able to do that. But there are a lot of tools out there, you know, expectations, worksheets, things you can chat with your advisor about. So there are a lot of tools and resources, individual development plans, that if your advisor isn't putting these things on your radar, you could do that. And then there's also worksheets, things like that related to feedback. And so a lot of the times the feedback tends to be from advisor to students, but there's also sort of mentor reflection kind of worksheets and things like that, and sort of mechanisms for you to be able to convey feedback. So I'd be happy to share some of that stuff with you. But we found that building a personal connection, also like spending a few minutes, especially at the beginning of meetings, to talk about things outside of work really fosters psychological safety in the work sort of relationship as well. So, you know, sometimes you kind of want to create a separation of work and personal life, which is, you know, at your personal discretion. But, you know, in some of the research we found, those things can be very helpful as well to build that connection.
Okay, I would appreciate those resources if
Yeah.
you have them. I don't want to monopolize, so I do have another question, but.
I have one that kind of.
Circle back.
Yeah, I have.
Chris,
I have a question that kind of builds off of that. Have you looked at doing something similar with the AI anonymizer feedback for grad students? Because I feel like in a research, in small research groups, probably not
Right.
as helpful, but in larger research groups, you could have like more safety for the grad students of it being anonymized, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what you just mentioned is kind of the reason why I've been a little hesitant to apply this in research groups. Because, if it's 3, 4 students, it probably doesn't make sense and they probably know who it's coming from. But you're right. As you kind of get into maybe 6, 7, 8+ students, potentially research scientists, postdocs, I definitely think this could be something that's helpful. And having somebody to kind of mediate that process, the AI, I think could be really good. So yeah, definitely something to consider. I know a lot of grad programs tend to do this either at the department level or the program level, and I've heard different strategies to do that. So for example, at the program level, I've heard of departments sort of, say if you have 30 faculty to like maybe make 5 clusters of 6, where then the feedback is like within that sort of group. So it's like you can sort of like create larger sort of like ways to help anonymize the feedback, if that makes sense. So kind of getting at the same idea of making larger sort of clusters to get feedback and synthesize it. But you don't know which types of comments are directly related to you necessarily if there's 4 other faculty in your group. Yeah.
Question from online, Dr. Finelli, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for your research. I'm just so inspired by all that you're doing. Very cool work. I especially like the application of the Gen AI piece to help synthesize student feedback in the new peer evaluation approach that you recommend. I do have a question. It looks like it would take more time in the classroom if the instructor is using the peer evaluation process in the classroom, as well as kind of more buy-in from the students to fill out those kind of lengthy descriptions of the peer evaluation piece. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how you might incentivize the instructors and the faculty to participate in this new process kind of before they see the benefits and the good results that will come in terms of the ability to work better on teams.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Dr. Finelli. So in terms of incentive for the students, they are graded on the quality of feedback they actually put in. And so that sort of incentivizes them to actually be spend a little bit more time and be intentional about how they're writing the feedback. And so I'm happy to share that rubric as well. It was pretty easy to create. And so as I kind of mentioned, we noticed a very stark difference, pre-post intervention in terms of the quality of feedback students were writing. And that's really, I think, from the student perspective, of course we have the reflections added on as well, but, and that takes a little time, thought, and effort for students to do. But I think at the same time, if we really want to, really assess the process of teamwork, we kind of have to do those types of things and embed them within the classroom. What kind of comes out and how this comes in, I think is at the instructor discretion. But teamwork is often a learning outcome in these courses. And so I think prioritizing, having students reflect and think about their teamwork is extremely valuable. From an instructor incentive perspective, we've had a lot of adopters within our department. And the first iteration of this, obviously, was very kind of manual. We had grad students helping generate the reports, plugging in the prompts. And with ChatGPT in particular is what we used, an earlier version of this. It can cost credits and money to be able to automatically generate these reports, right? And so right now we have a couple instructors in the department that are using an open source LLM, large language model, and programming it to be able to automatically do this. So instructors, all they have to do is upload or export, for example, their CATME file. And then since it's all locally stored using an open source LLM, it's all secure, their data, even though it's protected by FERPA. And so That's something we're going to pilot at Virginia Tech, is how to automate this process so it's just plug and play for instructors. And so we're hoping that'll break the barrier for everybody else, because right now it does require a lot of manual labor to do this in a secure way. So as soon as those things are available, I'm happy to also share it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I know we're past time, and I know Mark has a flight to catch. But thank you again for everyone for being here today and participating. And we hope to see you at future EER events. Thank you again for being here. Thank you, Mark, for visiting us.
Thank you for having me.